Okay, who's the chair? Thomas. Who's the chair? Okay. Oh, please go ahead. Okay.
After that formal introduction.
So this is topic-wise maybe not very directly EIC related, but it is to some degree, because this week is about what we can learn from PA collisions, for example, PP collisions for the EIC. And one of the big things, of course, we have observed in PA collision, PP collision, is these azimuthal anisotropies that also Mark talked about. And the question is really, do these come from features of, for example, the gluon distribution in a proton or a nucleus? And whether what we measure in PA collisions in terms of these V2 and V3 coefficients has anything to do with the initial state. And so this is more geared towards that, where I'm trying to do a calculation that's similar to what Mark does in the dense-dense limit, but couple that also to final state interaction. So I put frameworks here because initially I had two different frameworks planned. I don't think I'll get to the last one, which is the one where we couple essentially gluon distributions that we get out of this classical Yang-Mills calculation and plug it into a microscopic transport. But if you're interested in that, we can talk about that later also. Here I want to focus on taking the energy momentum tensor from the classical Yang-Mills and plug it into hydrodynamics and analyzing where do these anisotropies come from. Okay, so the question is, as I just said, what's the dominant origin of azimuthal anisotropies in small systems, meaning PP and PA collisions, for example, or so deuteron gold. And this calculation is going to include, in the initial part, the IP-Glasma calculation. That's essentially color gas condensate calculation. You solve classical Yang-Mills equations. So Mark has presented that in the dilute dense limit, and this is essentially the same thing, except you have the dense-dense calculation, and you compute Wilson lines and forward light cone and evolve them over time with Yang-Mills evolution. And then you get a configuration of fields, and you can compute the energy momentum tensor of those fields. And you couple this, you use this G mu nu as initial condition for hydrodynamics, and that includes shear and bulk viscosities. And then in the end, we even couple this to a microscopic ionic transport using URQMD, which takes care of the lower temperature region. What we'll do is try to fix all the parameters we have, including the transport parameters like eta over S, zeta over S, in heavy ion systems. Because the smaller systems really, I'm going to show, are so sensitive to all these things that it will be very hard. And basically this talk is also going to be about what are the problems with hydrodynamics in the small systems. Because we've seen actually many calculations where the data is reproduced fairly well at both RIC and LHC, but I think a lot of the intricacies of applying hydro to these small systems are usually swept under the rug. So I'm trying to show you that there are issues. Yeah, and then I'm going to do also the same thing for RIC and fix the parameters in gold-gold or uranium collisions, and then use that to predict what we would get in proton gold, deuteron gold collisions.
And you're going to also apply this at high PT?
No. So we're going to cut off at essentially 2 or 3 GeV. We won't go beyond.
That's pretty high.
That's already pretty high. And in principle, actually, I can show you that you shouldn't really trust it in small system above 1.5 GeV or so.
You don't expect the parameters in AA to be the same PA, right? Different transport.
Well, if they are temperature dependent, you would expect, if that's your, if you only characterize your system and its density by the temperature, then you wouldn't want to change.
So you say that the same temperature that you expect?
At a fixed temperature, I would assume a fixed eta over S, so zeta over S. Assuming I can disregard the baryon density. Right? Here, I am going to assume we have mu v equals 0 at here. But yeah. Okay. And so then this all should lead to determining where do these azimuthal anisotropies that we have in the final results come from in the final quantum spectra, and then also just the problem. So this is just a picture of this, what I just said. And
Come on the other side.
So I'm not going to go through all the details of how this is calculated in INT-plasma. I think this has been discussed quite a bit, and what Mark discussed is part of that. So we do solve Yang-Mills equations using incoming color currents, and these incoming color currents we constrain essentially the geometry of those, for example, and the x dependence of those are constrained using the IP-SAT model, which has parameters which are fit to Hera data. In particular here, for the small systems, we also include this part here, namely fluctuating substructures of the proton and of the deuteron, for example, which we model here by just having 3 hotspots of gluon density inside a proton. This is just really a model, and it doesn't have to be 3. It could be all kinds of numbers of hotspots. 3 is motivated by saying, oh, we have 3 valence quarks, but there could be more large x degrees of freedom. And the assumption is that the smaller x degrees of freedom are sort of located around these. It turned out that we needed such a substructure to describe incoherent effective Hera data, namely J-side production, for example. To describe the incoherent cross-section, particularly t-dependence of that, we needed fluctuations also of the geometry of the system. And so we used that data, again, to tune how much fluctuations we have, so to tune the parameters of these additional parameters that come with the substructure. And this is actually something where more data from an electron provider could also help constrain the parameters and constrain the models for that. In particular, what does the proton look like and how much fluctuates this geometrical picture? Because this will also be needed essentially for describing proton gold or proton lead data with this hydro picture. Because if we don't have the substructure, we just have a round proton, then we will not produce any V2 because we have an isotropic initial distribution where it will expand isotropically. And so all this calculation includes now tons of fluctuations, namely that of impact parameter, nuclear positions, quark positions, or hotspots positions, I should call it, the color charge normalization, but also the color charges themselves. So all this fluctuates.
So this is a nuclear substructure at very low scales.
Yeah. I mean, low scale, you mean small x. Yeah, that's right. So in principle,
what do you mean in terms of, I mean, in DIS, we have the Q square of the photon that helps you identify the substructure.
But this is
but here there is no, when you use applying to PA.
Yeah, that's why I constrain it using, well, you use vector meson production, right, diffractive.
Yeah,
and so you have the t-dependence of that.
Sensitive to that would be sensitive to
yeah.
But then when you use it in PA, it tells you you're probing the same scale.
Well, you're probing, basically, the scale you're probing is QS, right?
Yeah. So it's not very high.
The question is whether it matters there or not. Right?
Yeah,
if
no,
you're not probing the same
really,
scale.
This is really unknown.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, do what you can.
Right.
There's this issue which you can see EIC.
Right.
See the Q square dependence of this substructure.
Yeah, in more detail. And actually, the really fine substructure likely does not matter for PA, especially if you have this hydrodynamic picture with viscosity, but this is all smeared out. Right? This is really true. So this is really the main part here. How do I actually match now this initial energy momentum tensor that I calculate from the gluon fields in the Yang-Mills? How do I match that to hydrodynamics? Right? So what we used to always do in these older INT-plasma calculations with hydrodynamics, we would just extract the energy density and the flow velocity. So essentially the ideal part of that energy momentum tensor. So this should be also the classical Yang-Mills d mu here. And then this epsilon and u mu would be inputs into hydrodynamics. However, of course, then you're throwing away the viscous corrections that you have. And in principle, you would want to match the full T mu in order not to have a jump there, right? And so initially we thought, oh, that's just too large anyways, and hydro will just break down if we do this. But then in the small systems, we figure, well, let's just try it and see what happens if we include the full T mu. So in terms of these quantities that we have in hydrodynamics, energy density, u mu, and then pi mu, the shear stress tensor, we get that one as initial condition from just subtracting from the full T mu from the classical Young-Mills, the ideal part, right? Here, using the equation of state that we have there, namely epsilon, or P is epsilon over 3, right? So that's really then the full input, except for one more thing, which is that obviously the equation of state is different in the Young-Mills. It's just a conformal theory. And we want to match that to hydrodynamics, in which we use the sort of state-of-the-art lattice equation of state. So there will be a jump in the pressure, right? Just by using different equations of states on both sides. So in order to, again, smoothly match, we sort of put in an effective correction here called also pi, because it's like a bulk stress term, which is described by the difference between the pressures on the two sides of the matching. Right? So P.
You need for the class 3 amines have negative Boltzmann pressure or zero Boltzmann pressure, or what?
Yeah, so this will be sort of a negative term. So actually, it will be it will be a push outward. So it's like a negative bulk. So the bulk would, usually try to go against the expansion.
But the full T mu has a positive, but small longitudinal pressure, right? You're not matching at tau equals 0. You're matching at a finite tau. Yeah. Right. So it's above 0 Boltzmann pressure. It's above 0, but small. So this is why the bulk, the shear pi mu is small.
So CGC at tau equals 0,
it's negative.
Pressure is negative.
Yes.
Yeah, but he's not matching at tau equals 0.
Right.
He's not matching at tau equals
I
0.
understand, but the time goes to infinity, CGC lateral pressure is 0.
Goes to
It's
0.
also not matching at infinity either,
Yes.
right? Matching
somewhere
between 0 and
But
infinity.
basically, after a time 1 over QS, the longitudinal pressure is 0.
Mm-hmm.
After a time 1 over QS.
That's probably like wobbling around.
Yeah, we're wobbling around.
Yeah, but
So that you can absorb into this pi mu. Right?
What makes you confident that
Yeah.
in doing this matching, you're not somehow altering a little bit your initial state description?
Yeah. it is actually a problem, right? I mean, well, you could come from two sides and approach it. You could say, well, I want to smoothly match no matter what, right? So I don't want jumps anywhere in T mu, and then you have to do something like this. But of course, you're changing suddenly the physics, right? By changing the equation of state, for example, right? And the fact that you have no bulk viscosity, and then you suddenly have bulk viscosity in the hydro simulation, right? So in principle, you would want to smoothly equilibrate chemically and kinetically, right? Equilibrate to get rid of all of these problems. And maybe this effective kinetic theory prescription or so will help, doing this in a better way. Right now, we don't include that yet. We've started looking into this. But right now, we just have this sort of sharp switching at fixed time, and then you have problems like this, right? Because you suddenly change the physics of the system to some degree, right? So then you could argue, well, do I really want this extra term, right? But I think that's sort of the best thing you can do at this point when you switch at a fixed time, right? And you kind of want a smooth matching at least of the team. Okay, so these are the main things to consider. And just a few words which are not too relevant for what I'm gonna focus on, but equation of state, we use, as I said, a lattice equation of state. And we're actually using one that's a bit newer now. We used to use in older calculations this S95P, which was by Hurwin and Tretsky, using hot QCD results, older hot QCD results, I should say. And the new ones actually are the new hot QCD is the blue curve here in the speed of sound versus temperature. The Wuppertal Budapest is the red, and then the old extracted equation of state is the green one. So you see the speed of sound changes in this region around 200 MeV. And so because the speed of sound changes, actually the VNs change by about 10%. But adjusting VNs by 10% means you adjust your 8/S by almost 50%. So this is just to let you know that actually the 8/S we're using now are somewhat different from what other calculations before.
Are they higher or lower?
They are higher. Mm-hmm. They're higher. Because this gives you more push, right? or yeah, more flow, and you have to reduce it somewhat again. For the bulk viscosity, we're going to use something that's also just modeled. So we assume it's, well, we start from assuming something that's peaked around the transition temperature, and we just model it with some width and height, and tune these parameters to the heavy ion data. Later, actually in the RIC results, I will use a somewhat different parameterization, and we will have to rerun the LHC calculations also with that new one. So
I'm
yeah.
confused. Sorry, the bulk viscosity there at high temperature is essentially 0.
Yeah.
But you have a bulk pressure that you just showed on 2 slides ago. But the bulk pressure should be this zeta times the
No. The bulk pressure here, right? That's not a real bulk pressure. So I just absorb this difference between the pressure on the hydro side and pressure on the initial state side into an effective initial pi. This
The bulk viscosity being 0 just means that this pi relaxes to 0 very fast.
This will go away, right? With the relaxation time of the pi.
What the bulk viscosity tells you is how fast this initial condition relaxes to 0.
So essentially, that's also true for the initial pi mean, right?
So what height?
What?
It is like Israel stored type treatment.
Yeah, okay,
right. It will relax. So even if your bulk viscosity in your system is 0 everywhere, you will still have this, but it will relax away. Right?
Okay, I understand. But then it's really essential that you have this second order treatment, right?
Yeah.
Because in Navier-Stokes peak pi here to be equal to zeta times d mu.
Yeah, that wouldn't
There's
work.
no way on earth to match this. Okay, good.
So I could set all the viscosities to 0, right, but still have the initial pi mu and pi. They would just go away. So the feature of hydrodynamics would be just to remove these initial deviations from an ideal fluid. So then you can get first results here for mean PT in lead collisions at LHC. And so we compare here the 5 TeV results to the 2.76 TeV results. So you would expect to be a little bit above everywhere. But this goes from 0% to 80 to 90% centrality. And you only see deviations as you go to very peripheral. And the reasons for that may be, well, large corrections from viscosity actually in the system, kind of the description not working too well anymore with viscous hydro, but also that the bulk viscosity may be too small at low T. You maybe need a larger bulk viscosity, but we try to avoid having a large bulk viscosity in the region where we switch, because then we have large delta F corrections from the bulk. But maybe that's necessary somehow in order also to describe this. Also, we run your QMD for the low temperature part, so your QMD will have a bigger share in the peripheral ones, and maybe that doesn't have the right bulk viscosity either. Probably not. I don't know.
Why not?
Well, because of the bulk viscosity given by the inelastic collisions in there, essentially, and I don't think they have all the cross sections right for this.
You don't have to describe everything that's not just 60%.
Well, if I want to describe PA, I kind of want to do that.
When you said about PA,
it is all fine. It is all fine. So the message is going to be, it's all fine as you go to maybe up to 40% central heavy ion collisions. As you go beyond, you run into problems, but that means you're also running into problems in sources like PA.
So, remind me, what is the equivalent centrality?
I think you're around like 60%, 50-60% for the high multiplicity PA. Yeah.
Then you do want to.
Right. If you look at now P-lead and lead mean PT, this is what we get. It looks pretty bad at first sight, actually. So this is the lead, which becomes good, as we've seen, as you go to high multiplicity, but it kind of deviates at low multiplicity. And then you have the P-lead and the PP. If you look at the numbers, because this is not 0, right? Actually, we're only overestimating in this regime here, so the PP data by about 12% and P-lead by 8%. So it's not as bad as it looks, but certainly it doesn't describe it perfectly, right? As you go to low multiplicities. And I will show, things depend a lot on the details of the calculations. We'll see.
This is mean PT of gluons?
No, this is hadrons. This is all charged hadrons. So this hydro, you thermalize, you plug it into your QMD, you have everything in there.
So why is your PT decreasing with the multiplicity for the...
Here?
Yeah.
Why is it decreasing? Yeah, so I think
saturation
yeah.
at some level. I guess it's part of the hydro evolution, right?
Well, it has to do, I think, with the bulk viscosity. First of all, it's temperature dependent, but it also viscous corrections that may just go haywire there.
Oh, so you wouldn't trust it.
See, I wouldn't. Well, yeah. So I will get to the point where we'll say I won't trust it.
You missed that.
In that regime, right? So if you, now I just want to quickly sum up results in heavy ion collisions. So actually this was the calculation for lead at 5 TeV for V2, V3, and V4. So agreement is not quite perfect for V3, but actually, you know, over this wide range, I think 3 orders, at least 2 orders of magnitude. Well, let me see. Yeah, almost 2 orders of magnitude. In this, you get a decent description. Xenon, this was basically the prediction based on the having everything fixed for lead, and this was then the data. Not perfect, V3 is still a little bit large, but overall for V2 it looks pretty good. And then PLED, this is the data now, so we're a bit low there, but actually surprisingly good given the problems that we have, and that I'll discuss in more detail. And then PP actually goes the wrong way. But the data, if you don't subtract peripheral events, also goes that way. And you know, subtracting peripheral ones may be problematic because you're also subtracting initial state anisotropies, which you would also expect to have in the most peripheral events.
So
but
PP calculation, now you have the substructure model.
Yeah, that's in there. Right. Otherwise, you would. Well, in PP, you would still get a final result, but in PA, where essentially the fluctuations in the A don't matter so much, then you would get very small V2 and also V3, etc. But I don't want to dwell too much on this. I want to go actually into more in the details and see how is this anisotropy built up. So this is showing this measure, which is the momentum anisotropy in your T mu, right? So which is something you could take as a proxy to some degree for V2. Of course, V2 is going to be different because V2 just comes from the freeze-out surface, right? And you have some QMD after that and all that. But to first approximation, this tells you what's the anisotropy in the system. And the point is that if you do this Young-Mills calculation, you get a finite value of this anisotropy already. If you started out with something where you just isotropically sampled some particles, right, you would get 0 for the case where you use the full T mu, including all the viscous corrections, which is here's a dotted curve. If you only use the ideal part of T mu, so if you remove the pi mu from that, you would get something that's just continually increasing over time. Because after some initial time, 1/QS or so, what the Young-Mills will do is just free streaming, right? And in free streaming, essentially the full T mu expression for this will not change. It will just be a constant. But if you only take the ideal part, it will just grow, right? Because you can think of it in terms of the ideal part is dominated by the flow velocities in the X and in the Y direction. And if you go far away and let this free stream, you know, if you look at some point, you will have particles only going in the direction on the side where you're looking. So this anisotropy will keep going up until it saturates. I guess it will saturate to 1 or something. However, the pi mu, the corrections, the viscous corrections will also grow when you do that in free streaming in such a way that actually for the full result it will compensate. And then you just have a constant because free streaming doesn't do anything to this anisotropy, including using the full T mu. So this is what you see here. And actually this first part here where this grows rapidly is, well, there's some interactions, first of all, in the Young-Mills. You have this commutator term of your Gruen field, so they do interact, but also you can think of it as a decoherence that happens over this time scale 1/QS. Initially, you have only fields aligned in the Z direction, both E and B field, and they will, all the different modes will decohere over a time scale 1/QS, and then you actually see the intrinsic anisotropy that you had in the beginning, which is essentially the one that Mark has been talking about. So this is in here, and then you plug this into hydrodynamics. right? And then the question is, what does the hydrodynamics do? And this is just saying what I just told you. So what does the hydrodynamics do? Well, it will further evolve this. Maybe I put too many curves. So focus first only on the solid. Well, yeah, focus on the solid line. So this is when we match to hydro at 0.6 Fermi. And focus only now on the solid red one, right? So this is using the full T mu nu in this expression, and we're switching at 0.6 Fermi. And so you see, okay, we have perfect matching by construction because the T mu nus looks the same. And then, okay, then we have, first of all, a little bit of a decrease. This has to do also with the fact that the initial anisotropy, that's not something that's really aligned with the geometry generated anisotropy. So this may destroy a little bit of the hydroevolution may first destroy a little bit of your initial anisotropy before, after some time, the pressure gradients take over and the typical hydro picture kicks in, where you really convert initial space-time or spatial anisotropy into momentum anisotropy. And then you see, okay, it grows, and then eventually it more or less saturates after 3 Fermi. So this is a P-led collision in the bin of 80 to 90% central headlet. So that's pretty low, well, low-ish one. And so it doesn't live all that long. It lives fairly long compared to what you would get without bulk viscosity, because the bulk viscosity will keep the system alive longer because it's counteracting the rapid expansion. And then the other curves are just, on the one hand, switching at 0.2 Fermi, that's the dashed lines, and then also the ones where I only use the ideal part of the thing. The difference here you see between switching at 0.2 Fermi and switching at 0.6 Fermi actually is not that large. So you're comparing, for example, the red dashed with the red solid. So it is a bit more, you sort of get a larger V2, if you will, if you switch to hydro early. So hydro has more time to convert this spatial anisotropy.
Are you able on this spot to identify where there is a phase transition? From 2GP to
well, it's hard because this average goes over, so I wrote it here, so it's average over all space with the weight of the energy density. So
it's kind of smears this.
Yeah, right. So you don't have such a resolution power, if you will, in terms of temperature dependence of this. So you kind of average over everything and weigh this with the energy density. So it actually weighs more the higher energy density part, just to basically remove stuff that's really outside. And so, I mean, this doesn't really tell you exactly that 50% of the final anisotropy comes from the initial state, but I just want to point out that around 45% of the final value was already there in the initial state. And in the case where you start a bit earlier, it was like 35%, so generated a bit more later. The effect of bulk viscosity is shown here. Again, only focus on the red curves, maybe that's the one with the full T mu nu. And you see, if you don't have bulk viscosity, which is the dashed curve, the evolution time is cut short a lot because the system expands more rapidly, cools down more quickly, and so you're running to freeze out earlier. Whereas the bulk viscosity keeps the system alive by slowing down the radial expansion, and so you live significantly longer. And also, you have more time then to build up more anisotropy in the hydrodynamic phase.
Why are the slopes different?
Slopes of what?
Why are the slopes of the two red?
Oh, why these are so different? I think it's not obvious. And there's actually one thing I should point out. You see the solid. Let me see. Yeah, you see the red lines, the red solid line also crossing the blue solid line, which actually would not happen typically unless you include the bulk correction in also here in the denominator. So only because of the fact that we have bulk viscosity, we can actually reduce this denominator because it goes in with a negative sign. These will cross. So the details of the slope also depend somewhat on the effect of bulk viscosity, which you remove here, right? So I think that's probably why. So this is actually a large effect, and that I show you a dramatic problem with that in a little bit. So this is just summarizing this. I don't think I have to go. Actually, I just wanted to mention this thing. This is what we mentioned before. So the effect that hydrodynamics has, right, is essentially to dynamically reduce this initial pi mu and then possibly generate its own anisotropy. Sorry. But then I think, as we already mentioned, then you have tricky questions about artifacts of matching, right? So because it matters now at what time you match, because we've said the pi mu correction actually grows with time, and also the ideal part of the flow grows with time. If you just run the Young-Mills, and so if you switch later, you have a larger pi mu to get rid of in the hydro, and you have more initial flow essentially. So all this it's not very well under control, right? If you really just match at a fixed time. So
so you had an important contribution from initial state, important contribution from viscosity, which kind of like 2-3 years, maybe 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So there's like a shift of.
Well, so you're referring to the heavy ion calculation from a few days ago. So there's several things that changed. So one of them was the equation of state, right? So the equation of state, as I showed, is actually has a different speed of sound. You get a more extreme expansion. So you actually had to increase the viscosities, both bulk and shear, to counteract that somewhat. So you need a larger bulk, even in the heavy ion calculations. Also, in the older calculations, we never focused much on the mean PT, which we maybe should have. So the mean PT was somewhat off. The mean PT was actually too large, for the pions especially. So when we looked at the spectra, we always underestimated the pions at low PT, and so this would give you a too large mean PT. And again, that's something that the bulk viscosity corrects. Also, we did not include the initial pi mu and pi, which in heavy ions doesn't do too much, but in the small system, again, which is what this is, it matters more. You get also this initial push from the this effective bulk piece, from the change of equation of state, and yeah. So these are all pieces that we learned over time, right? And so they add to somewhat of a change of. But for heavy ions, as you go to 20-30% central ones, this is not a large effect at all, right? But for the small systems, which only live for like 3 Fermi, it is. This is also shown here. So this is actually a calculation without bulk first, where we just turned off the initial flow, right? So we would wanted to know what happens if we don't include the initial UU from the Young-Mills and see what do we get for the final momentum anisotropy. And you see it's quite dramatic, actually. You don't build up very much at all. And I'll show in the RIC results essentially why this happens here. I think the reason is mostly we switch fairly late at 26, so the system doesn't have much time actually to build this up. So also see here, there's not much difference actually. There's not much build up, a little bit maybe here. But essentially the value that you have in the end is very close to the value you had in the beginning. So not much is happening here. If you do now the same thing with bulk viscosity, you see there is problem somewhere, right? So you see these spikes. And I mentioned this before. What can happen here if the bulk correction is too large, right? You run through 0 in the denominator because you can have negative pressures popping up, right? And these spikes here happen essentially when there's a large part on the lattice where you run through 0, right? So there's obviously something not good, right? In these viscous hydro calculations, which have this fairly large bulk, right? Because we fixed this in the heavy ion collision calculations. But now we go to very peripheral, and we see this bulk corrections have a large effect. For some reason you don't see it in the solid red curve, but that may be a coincidence, right? You see it when you do it when you remove the initial flow. So I don't know why it shows up.
Curve that is smooth.
Yeah.
5 times bigger value than if you had no bulk. Right?
Yeah. So
it
is a large correction. And so this is another picture that I've shown before, but it also shows this problem. So what's plotted is 1 plus pi over p. So when this is negative, you have effectively negative pressure, right? And this is particularly happening in the blue regions. And you see a lot of blue regions. And you actually see these kind of interesting effects here, which you could interpret as sort of cavitation, right? Because you have these sort of negative pressure regions and stuff is sucked in, and then you get these holes, and you obviously have this ring where the bulk viscosity is largest. So this is temperature region. So you collect all your stuff in this ring, which is okay. But the problem is that you have these negative pressure regions, which tells you, well, we're kind of outside the regime of validity of this whole thing. Oh, this moves. Okay, so there you see the animation. I forgot it did that. I don't know why they all do that. Okay, now actually I want to go to Rick, because this is something that also Mark has focused on, namely the different systems, right? So the point was that Phoenix said, okay, let's see whether this, this anisotropy follows what we expect from what hydrodynamics would do, right? So if hydrodynamics or some final state interaction is the main driver of this anisotropy, then you would think that in systems that have, on average, a larger, let's say V3, right? Epsilon 3, so a larger initial triangularity, which would happen, for example, in helium-3 gold collisions, then you would expect from hydro that you get larger V3 also on average, right? So this was the point of this study, where you looked at proton gold, deuteron gold, helium-3 gold, and because these eccentricities are different in these different systems, the expectation is from the hydro picture, final state picture, that the V3s follow this ordering. The initial state, at the time when they did this, it wasn't obvious, and maybe it's still not quite obvious in what it would predict. Mark has shown that actually at least some of these features are also reproduced in the initial state picture, but it's not as easy to understand as in this hydrodynamic picture why this ordering, for example, of larger V2 in deuteron gold than in proton gold would occur in the initial state picture. So the motivation was to show, well, is this hydro or not? And so again, what we do first in our prescription, in our framework, is to do this whole study for gold-gold collision and fix all the parameters again. And again, we see actually for gold-gold at RIG, we can get a very good description of the charged particle multiplicity as a function of centrality for different identified particles and charge shadows. That's shown here. The mean PT, so we modified the bulk parameterization here. And I would say, yes, we have to redo the LHC calculation with the same parameterization. But we modified this a little bit so that the peak is not as sharp and high, but broader. And so this helps somewhat. And also it doesn't drop as much at lower temperatures. So we can actually get also better description, even up to 80 to 90%, right? And then here's the V2. First, this is V22, the black points, and also the purple points from a slightly different analysis, more recent analysis. And our result is the red ones. And you see up to 30 to 40% or so, we're okay, and then we underestimate. The reason, though, is understood because this is a two-particle correlation, and the rapidity gap is like 0.3 or something, so it's very small. So you have a lot of non-flow effects, so you have digits and stuff, which we don't have. So we would expect the deviation from the data, which is what we see. But then you should say, okay, then for V24, where you remove a bunch of this no-flow, you should do better, and indeed we do. So the data is these green points, and our calculation for V24 is the light blue ones, and there we do much better. So this is actually probably better than I would believe, but it works pretty well with this whole fixed set of parameters. A new bulk viscosity, which I can show you in the backup, and this value of 8 over S of 0.12. So now, after we fixed all this, and it works pretty well in gold, we can look at this system scan. And the first thing is to reproduce the multiplicity distribution in D-gold. Actually, what I'm plotting here is gluons. That's the blue curve. So that's the gluons from IP plasma. Essentially, more or less what Mark would calculate, except right in this dense approximation. And I folded this with a Poisson, and the reason is just that we expect more fluctuations. Poisson is because if we were in the hydro picture and in the grand canonical ensemble, then the fluctuations at hadronization would be constant. So that's sort of just what we would expect in our framework. Of course, if you plug those gluons into Pythia or something, you would get a different additional fluctuations.
So does this have the QS fluctuations also?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yes.
so it really has all the sources of fluctuation that Mark does.
Yes. Exactly.
Not
for the blue curve.
Not necessarily implemented in the same way, but all the same physics
ingredients
are there.
Right. And this is deuteron gold, and the deuteron also has the substructure fluctuation. But they don't do too much for the multiplicity fluctuation. So yeah, so we are a little bit not quite wide enough, but okay. It's not too bad in comparison to the deuteron gold data. I'm not sure if it's corrected actually. It may not.
I think this is correct.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, or at least they give you the corrected mean multiplicity.
Uh-huh.
That's actually what it is.
Okay.
That's the only. So I think this is uncorrected.
Yeah. It's what? It's
this is uncorrected, but it's known what the corrected average multiplicity is or something, and you can sort of rescale.
But it is normalized to the mean, of course, right? So at 1 we have the average, and then this is just on the relative fluctuation. But okay.
So how does QS fluctuate again?
So it's essentially normalization. So what we do is, since we have these 3 hotspots per proton, we fluctuate the normalization within that around the mean QS, and we let the log of QS fluctuate for some width, which is a parameter which we also actually tune to this Hera data of the J-psi production. So the small t behavior of your diffractive J-psi incoherent cross-section will depend on that.
So QS will fluctuate from an event to another, right?
Yeah.
That's what you mean?
Actually,
when
from
you sample the sources.
Yeah.
So you sample the source of one event, or?
No. So basically, what refers to, right? We have the color charge density, right, for each blob, right? Be it the hotspots within the proton or just one proton or so, and then we fluctuate the normalization of that first, and then sample the color charges from that, right? And how this normalization fluctuates, that's what I call additional, or what Thomas called additional QS fluctuation. Of course, QS fluctuates always because of the geometry.
Yeah. But this is basically based on this Larry and whose paper was it?
Well, we did it before that, but then they elaborated on it. We needed it also in this first paper. We looked at proton, that multiplicity distribution. We saw they were quite a bit narrow if we didn't have that. And then, yeah, Pritvish and Larry looked at it. Okay, so now I'm looking at the same thing as I did before in proton-net, right? But I'm comparing P-gold and D-gold, right? And we know the data, I should have shown it, but the data shows exactly what was expected, that D-gold has a somewhat larger V2 than P-gold. Now, looking at what my initial state gives me, and this is, not what you should interpret as V2 exactly, right? Because as Mark showed, things depend on momentum and all kinds of things, right? If you do the calculation like Mark does it. Here, I'm really just evaluating this sort of averaged, so spatially averaged momentum anisotropy of T mu U, right? But what I see is that actually the red curve is below the black curve, so the initial anisotropy in deuteron gold actually turns out to be smaller than in proton gold, right? Because you have different area, different QS on average, because, well, actually this is for 0 to 5% of both, I should say, so the multiplicity is actually somewhat higher in deuteron gold here, but this is what Phoenix compared at first, right? So you see, well, okay, you can't say much about this. These are actually almost equal, right? So there's not much difference. But then the hydro does what you expect the hydro would do. You generate a somewhat larger momentum anisotropy in deuteron gold than proton gold because the eccentricity is larger in deuteron gold, right? So this is what you would expect from hydro. Just focus on the solid lines. That's the one with the full T median. Okay. Then what I do here is show what happens if I change the switching time, right? And see if things depend on that. So green now is this IP glass momentum anisotropy. Again, just look at the solid lines. That's the one with the full T mu. And then the black curve is the one that I get from the hydro when I switch at 0.4 Fermi, and the red curve is the one I get from the hydro when I switch at 0.6 Fermi. And the evolution is somewhat different, but the final values are actually pretty close. So it's not too much difference there. But you see, actually, it makes quite a bit of difference in evolution when I switch. And my point will be to say, well, things depend on a lot of things here, very sensitively. And you should be really careful when you see hydro results for these small systems, because they will depend on a lot of inputs that people may not necessarily even tell you. So here's another thing, which is the comparison, again, of what happens if I turn off this initial anisotropy. And the interesting thing here is to see that the black curve is the full result. Okay, it generates quite a bit of anisotropy, and I have a value of 0.15 in the end. If I turn this initial one off, not much happens here. And we were like, what's going on? You would think that still the hydro would build up flow, right? So we looked at what one event in these situations looks like. So this is the one with the full result. So this first one would correspond to the black line, right? Here the red line actually is the one, I didn't say that, where we kept the initial flow but turned off the initial timing. And also that makes quite a difference, as you see, in small systems. But let me show you the video for what the evolution of the energy density in the transverse plane looks like for this black curve. And it looks like this, and it looks similar to what I've shown you before in PLAD, right? So you have this expansion, and then you have this kind of cavitation-looking like thing that comes from the large bulk viscosity. But you see, you know, it expands reasonably fast, and things flow upwards. Now I want to show you what you get in this case, where you turn off the initial flow. And this is, I think, this one. It's just sitting there. So it tries to build up flow. The bulk viscosity is so large, it tries to keep it in. And actually, the thing is kind of not much expanding in the transverse plane. It's kind of, it looks like it's contracting. So you start having gradients and start to expand, but then immediately the bulk viscosity tries to slow it down. So this is an
final particles just sort of slowly leak out.
Well, yeah, you have a very small mean PT. I mean, it's not just
dilutes.
It's a lot smaller.
Longitudinally expands and cools and
yes.
sits there and doesn't.
That's what I was going to ask. The mean PT presumably doesn't come anywhere near the data.
Yeah, it'll be too small. Very small.
So in both simulations you have bulk viscosity.
Yes, in both simulations of bulk viscosity. The only difference was I turned off the initial flow and the initial timing you actually. But that's not the main effect. The main effect is that I just have it sit there, and then it tries to expand, but it can't. So that's what's happening there. If you had smaller bulk, it wouldn't be as dramatic. So I think you still have to look at that. So now you want to. Okay.
What makes it expand in the first case? So what is it cavitized?
No, I mean in the first case you already have an outgoing initial flow. So right. So from the Young-Mills, I just turned it off by hand in the second case. Yeah. Just essentially mostly from free streaming, you have stuff moving outwards. Right?
So you're saying that this is actually initial.
The initial flow, yeah. And here it looks like the initial flow is absolutely essential, right, to get even close to the data. And this is the data for V2 in proton gold on the left and deuteron gold on the right. The dots are the data in Phoenix. And this is our results. And here I have to say we haven't tuned anything except in gold-gold collisions, right? So we're too high, but it's not so bad. But again, with the caveats, which I will focus on in the next few slides also, which show you that things are very sensitive to all the details. But this is what came out first. So it looks actually pretty good. And the DND data in these 0 to 5% bins are actually also close to the data in those bins. And then you may say, okay, let's compare same multiplicities. What do we get? And what Phoenix did is look at P gold in 0 to 5%, P gold in 20 to 40. That gives you roughly 10 DND data, I think, in both cases. What we get is also roughly 10, so almost in these bins, so 9.8 and 11.3 respectively. And here's what we get. You actually get the same ordering and everything, but we get much closer result in terms of where proton gold and deuteron gold V2 lies. So what a bit large. But then I should say, if we just slightly alter, well, not too slightly, but we alter the parameters of the fluctuating proton, which will affect mostly the proton gold results, and not much the deuteron gold results. Because in deuteron gold, the V2 is driven by having 2 nucleons present, and the substructure of them doesn't matter too much. However, this dash curve actually, well, it's not really compatible with the Hera data. But then the Hera data is also slightly different X, right, than what we have here. So, you know, there's some freedom. So if people do a calculation and they have this proton substructure as a free parameter, I'm not surprised they can describe both data at the same time. If you constrain it, you don't necessarily describe it, right? But if you keep sort of the proton shape as a free parameter, as has been done in other calculations, then you can definitely describe deuteron gold and proton gold at the same time. Okay.
What do you mean by other calculations?
Romachke, yeah. So the ring to rule them all, or the fluid to rule them all, does exactly that. Right? His paper with weather, right? So they have a free parameter, which is the gluon, essentially the substructure of the proton, right? And they can tune that to get the proton gold V2 correct, right? And they also have it in Duran gold, but the Duran gold is almost not affected by changing the proton structure.
It's a hydro calculation, right? It's hydro calculation.
In the hydro calculation, yeah.
But I thought you said if you didn't have an initial
well,
anisotropy, you couldn't actually get hydro to.
Yeah, I mean, he also puts in some initial flow.
Also have some
yeah, but what's his bulk viscosity?
But his bulk viscosity is essentially 0, right? And so it's a different picture actually, right? We could do the same. We can turn bulk off, right, and play all kinds of games. But the point was to fix our parameters in gold, and then we need this.
They have the corrected average PT.
Yeah. But the reason is they don't have that much initial flow, and also their geometry is less compact. So in this calculation, we have a much more compact initial geometry. So we have larger gradients, so we have more explosive expansion than what they have. And so they need less bulk to compensate for that also. Okay. So there's a bunch of differences in terms of the geometry and also the transport parameters. One word of caution is also that if you compare Phoenix data and star data, and I want to focus on what they say is the best one, which is the template fit, then actually the V2 at the same multiplicity in proton gold and Duran gold don't differ very much in star, but you see, well, I would say, you could say within systematics, they do differ in Phoenix. So this has to be sorted out also, right? So maybe this being so close is not that bad in comparison to data.
It's the same centrality.
Yeah, this is also 10 particles per superfluidity, same as in this one, roughly the same.
I think they're measured differently.
They're measured differently, right? And actually, this is much lower also, especially at higher PT. Right? If you look at the scale, this is 0.05, right, which would be down here. So they differ quite a bit. Yeah.
Even the data don't.
The data don't.
The experimental.
Yeah.
Well, they're not exactly the same, right? Because isn't the star one the V2.4 and Phoenix measures V2 with respect to the particles going forward to reaction time.
So it's not the same.
I think it's V2.4, right?
Yeah.
I think star looks like V2.4, but what Phoenix does is not V2.4.
No, yeah, I don't think I think it's V2.2, but
But the extraction is certainly different.
Yeah, well, Phoenix is that vent plane, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's.
And this is not a template fit or anything. So actually, they don't really remove non-flow.
Yeah.
very
But
much.
there is a lot less non-flow because you measure the event plane several units of rapidity.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't it not? It's a 2-particle or event plane. I mean, their event plane resolution is so bad, right? That it's basically equivalent to 2-particle V2. My understanding was that these. I mean, at the end of the day, they should really be the same.
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of non-flow effects that are removed differently or not, or taken care of differently. So I don't know at this point. I'm not sure whether Star and Phoenix really know. So Barbara's slightly shaking her head.
I actually don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. So we'll see. I hope. I mean, this has to be worked out also, right? I mean, but let's focus on problems with my calculations. The other thing is also V3 doesn't work out quite well. So if we do what we do, we get a V3 that's basically effectively larger now than what the data has. We try to also play a little bit by hand with the initial geometry and the P goal and so on. And it didn't do all very much. You could say, okay, if I increase the viscosity, this will bring down everything and will bring down the higher harmonics a bit more. So if you had this dial, right, of increasing eta over S, then actually you could probably get a much better agreement. Maybe not perfectly, but better. But the point was to say, no, we don't have that freedom. We fix everything in gold and let it be. But maybe playing with a temperature-dependent eta over S, which we haven't here, may help. Although we have the temperature dependent to some degree in your QED, if you will, at low temperature. And the very high temperature, it cannot rise very rapidly from everything I've seen. So I don't know if there's much room really for.
So how did you do on helium-3 gold?
We haven't looked at it in the recent calculations yet. I had some older calculations which were a bit more crude, and we did okay. But there we actually tuned the parameters to describe D gold, and then vice versa. Actually, we calculated for helium-3 gold and predicted the D gold V3. That worked out. But here I would say we probably just above everything also. But we have to do it again.
Can you somehow assess how much of this V3 is kind of initial state, and so how much is present already at this?
Of the V3?
Of V3 is present already at the switching, and how much is geometry?
Yeah. So for V3, there may be, but I think there's certainly not an easy epsilon P equivalent for V3. I think Derek Teeny maybe came up with something that kind of works similarly for triangularity. But there's no, to my knowledge, at least, apart from that maybe, there's no similar thing where you can measure a triangular momentum anisotropy with just TXX, TYY, and so on. Derek had something, so I have to look into this. So if you can do that, then you could do the same analysis as for this elliptic anisotropy. So we have to look into that, right? Because yeah, you have some initial V3 also in this. So yeah, I mean, you could maybe freeze out much earlier or something.
But they involve now correlator of shooting to relate to this proper epsilon. So there is a paper by Jean-Yves Littrot and Paul Blaiseau.
Okay. Maybe that's what I was thinking. I thought it was there.
Epsilon 2, epsilon 3.
Yeah.
In a better way than the proxy you are using for it.
Yeah.
And they show that this will be proportional to V3 to V2.
Okay.
In the high
so it's probably, yeah. Okay, I'll look into whether we can.
It involves more than just team.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Okay. Now, so we can look into just plugging that in. I hope it's not too hard to. Yeah, if it's straightforward, then that's no problem.
The helium-3 is really very useful.
Yeah. Okay. Now to some issues. So this is not too big of an issue. So this is now what happens with different switching times. And you see, if you have earlier times, you get a different ordering. But actually, if you look at it, at low PT, you get less V2 with the earlier switching time. But at high PT, you get more. I think the reason for what's happening here is actually the fact that in the pre-steaming phase, the pi mu, the initial one, grows. And so you actually start off with a larger viscous correction, which has an effect over the whole evolution. And so that's probably what reduces V2 at high PT as you evolve longer in the pre-steaming phase and then switch to hydro. But I mean, the differences are not too huge, actually. So you see, to some degree, this free-streaming evolution compensates for the hydro evolution and vice versa. But if you only look up to 1.5 or so.
There should be a PT where you don't trust your hydro.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I can show you that basically that PT is between 1 and 1.5, actually, because of the viscous correction they get in the end. If you look at...
So where are we supposed to be looking?
Well, in principle, only up to here. So forget the right-hand side of that.
I see. So the part where it agrees, we shouldn't look at.
Yeah. No. The part where it agrees, you should look at.
Yeah,
so the left
he
is
wants us to look at the part.
But I also want to show you, where things go wrong, right? And then here, things also go wrong. But this is something you expect from what you've seen before to some degree. So the full result, again, is this black curve, right? That's I've shown you before. The red one is if I turn off the initial pi mu. So that's a huge effect, right? Even in the final result, after all evolution is done and everything, right? So you get like almost factor 2 larger V2, just from this initial correction, right? So here you cannot argue that it's a small correction over time. No, it's really the initial correction of pi mu, which is probably too much for this framework to handle. If you turn off both initial pi mu and the initial flow, as you would expect from what you've seen before, you essentially get no V2 because the thing is just sitting there, right, and not doing anything. So that's a problem. That's a big problem. This is if I switch, oh yeah, this was if I switch at 0.4 Fermi. If I switch at 0.2 Fermi, so a bit earlier, hydro has a bit more time to build up some V2 even without the initial flow, but it's still quite below the data, and it also has a funny shape somehow. So in this framework, you cannot get close to data without the initial flow. And that brings me already to conclusions. So one good note is in heavy ion collisions, this all seems to be fairly under control as long as you sort of up to like 40% centrality or so. And you can, but actually it works further out, even though you should take it with a grain of salt. It works out to larger centralities, and you can describe the data pretty well. Initial state contributes to the final anisotropy in PA. I think in this framework that's absolutely clear. If you turn off or change something in initial state, you change dramatically your final V2s. But things depend on switching time, transfer parameters, and whether you include the initial corrections or not. So things depend dramatically on that. The large bulk viscosity, as I've shown, is a problem, especially in these small systems. It would cause negative pressures, large delta F corrections, which I haven't shown yet, but I have them in the backup. And really, it seems to dominate the evolution in these small systems, more so than we would like. So yeah, the question is, can we really trust hydro there? You can make your own, draw your own conclusion, but there's certainly problems with that. And yeah, so let me stop here, and then we can show you. Actually, let me show you this picture of the delta F because it was asked. This is not quite this calculation, but an early calculation. But I think it looks similar. So this is a distribution, probability distribution of delta F over F, so the viscous correction relative to the ideal or equilibrium distribution function on the freeze-out surface at different PT essentially, or MT here. I think this is for pions or whatever. So you can take this as roughly PT. If you had low PT, that's the blue curve. It's peaked around 0, so you have small delta F a lot. But you see, you go to the point where actually the correction is as large as your equilibrium distribution at that PT, and you actually go to things like 4 times that or more, and also in the other direction. If you go to higher PT, even just 1 GV in MT, it looks much worse already, and for 1.5, even more so. So this is just showing where the corrections are actually larger. So in how many cells are the corrections larger than your equilibrium distributions? And it's 10% for 0.45, 0.5 GV, but it's already 45% of the cases at 1.5 GV.
That's why you don't trust it.
That's why I don't trust it at basically 1 GV and above, right? This is not exactly, as I said, the calculation that I showed here, but something older. And this may actually not include bulk viscosity, so it may get even worse when we have the bulk viscosity. So yeah, and with that, let me jump back to the conclusion. Thank you. Thomas, go ahead.
Yours going to be more specific question.
No, go ahead. I mean, no.
You're the chair. You have the
chair.
So if you could go back by 1 slide, please. So I'm looking at this, and I want to ask my pesky question yet again. So what do I expect in an EA collision? Presumably there's no initial flow.
What EA collision?
Yeah.
You said it was relevant.
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons I asked. The other is that I've gotten a whole variety of interesting answers to that question over the last couple of years. So I'm curious, from this study, what would you expect? Do you see any V2 at all?
I would expect an initial anisotropy to some degree. The question is, well, we're trying to do this calculation with digest in EA. I don't think you can do really calculation like this because this is a dense already assumption in the initial state, right? So you assume that both projectile and target are dense. And then you have a final state interaction. So I don't think there's maybe high multiplicity EA collisions, but I think these high multiplicities are still pretty low. So if there's any anisotropy, this has to come from something like an initial state, right? I don't think there will be any.
It will all be non-flow.
It will all be non-flow.
So
if flow is what the final state generates. Yeah.
If you had a photon which is nearly on shell, we could imagine that's really row nucleus scattering. So do you think meson nucleus scattering is going to be very different than proton nucleus scattering?
Okay. Well, but this
so
is
got two hotspots. Maybe.
Yeah. But if it's a row, I mean, then it's much harder to calculate, right? I mean,
why?
You can't. I mean, don't you have non-perturbative effects?
In the proton, the non-perturbative effects.
Why is row A different than P?
Okay, fine.
The difference is that only two, maybe a little bit less hotspot.
Right.
But that's kind of unfortunate. I guess they can't do this experiment, but it would be interesting to see. I think if you take a real photon, a good percentage of the time, that is like a row meson. It's not exactly a row, something like that.
Yeah.
Two non-perturbative quarks, which aren't so different than a bound state meson.
Okay.
So the question would be whether one could dial somewhere in.
Yeah, well, you can dial a meson rather than a proton, right?
Yeah, so
Well, he can do it
use
more
the-
easily than us, but maybe by selecting the kinematics correctly.
Right.
we can
All right,
balance that.
you can do Q-square small
Yeah.
in the ET conditions.
Yeah,
It's called
but still-
photoproduction.
Yeah.
Still, I don't think the dense calculation would be the right thing to do there, right?
For a meson.
Yeah.
But it is for the proton.
Well,
Well, you could get
how large is the QS and the meson coming from the?
How large is the QS for proton?
Let's say you can get up to
QS on the
0.5
meson
dB.
is two-thirds of
Look, the energy density in the meson is maybe 2/3 that of a proton, and there's 2 quarks. So maybe there's a little depletion, but 2/3 doesn't change a picture.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I guess if you can read out all these events, right? Then it should.
It would be kind of interesting if they could do this. But unfortunately, it's neither REC nor LHC can get meson. So
Yeah.
Well, you can get photo production ultra.
they can get ultra peripheral occlusion would be kind of interesting. Yes.
It's okay to leave something for you guys.
No, you're right. Ultra
Yeah, we
peripheral
can-
occlusion, of course, are essentially zero mass photon. Are
Yeah.
all zero mass. So yeah.
Yeah.
The question, I think the question there is what you can trigger on.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they couldn't trigger all this.
Well, you could trigger on multiplicity also. Well, how do you do that, right? In some,
You have to separate it from peripheral AA
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Well,
It has to be. I mean, for example, to have a UPC, somehow you have to have nothing on one side of the detector somehow.
right. It will be some,
It's exclusive on the side of the nucleus emitting the photon.
Right. Rapidity depends.
So there's a gap on one side, and then lots of stuff on the other side.
Which is, again, not so trivial.
Yeah.
They barely can do it with projects. So you have to buy the order from 1G.
But then you won't like it because it's too high.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's more of a problem for the hydro part, right? But of course, if you argue it's just the same densities as in PA, right? Then you can try the same thing. But it's already, as I said, problematic here. So it's real pretty problematic there. Yeah.
So if I compare your calculation to Paul Romatschke's one fluid to rule them all, there are several. I guess there are several differences, right?
Yes.
What do you think is the most important, the bulk viscosity or?
Bulk viscosity is a big part, and but the bulk viscosity is there in our case because we have already a different initial state, right? So he has different initial flow, and he's as I said, a larger area that he distributes things on, right? In terms of
Is it like a wounded nuclear?
It's kind of like a wounded nucleon Monte Carlo Glauber type thing where the size of the nucleons is a parameter, right? And so I don't know. You looked only at 0 to 5% gold, 0 to 5% D gold, P gold, or lead, I guess. Lead, P lead, and PP. So I also don't know how he gets the neutrality dependence in lead, and so on.
So one of the things you said that, if I understood correctly, you need the large bulk viscosity to get the mean PT down.
Yeah.
So how does Paul? How does he do that?
Yeah, he gets the mean. He doesn't even get as large radial flow to begin with.
He has a bigger system, so less radial flow, so he doesn't need as much bulk viscosity to get the mean PT.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's a question of somehow how the size. In some sense, the initial state is different. He has a larger initial state, spatial extent,
right. and
that ends up in different parameters, different values for all kinds of parameters.
And for example, there's this Trento calculation where they did this Bayesian analysis, and there they actually do have initial flow, and probably on the same order of what we have, and they still need small bulk viscosity. But again, that comes from the fact that their size, actually, I think their width parameter for for the energy density distribution for each nucleon, right, is more than twice as large as what we have. And ours is somewhat constrained from IPSat again,
which gives you kind of
this 0.4 essentially for me, and they have like 1.2 or it's much larger.
That's the radius. That's the radius. It's like 1.2.
Yeah, it's the radius, or it's the width of that Gaussian.
So basically, does Trento take this width from like nuclear?
No, wait, they have it as a free parameter in their Bayesian analysis, and so somehow the Bayesian analysis prefers smaller bulk and larger size. But it could go another way. Who knows what that thing does? Right? It just likes it better that way.
So the community outside this room is debating between the ionic and electronic radius of the proton. But in the Hegelian community, the radius can vary by a factor of 3.
Exactly. No, I said the same thing. We have introduced a new radius puzzle. Right?
Our radius puzzle is a lot bigger than theirs.
Yeah.
It's a lot more severe.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's something wrong in our picture someplace else.
Yeah, well, so much depends on that, so people can see.
Yeah, I mean, the point is to try and constrain it from somewhere else, right? That's what we tried. I mean, I don't know how
That's
good it is.
That's why we need the IC.
Yes, exactly. That was in my third slide. That's why we need the IC to constrain, these initial conditions better, right? But if it's 1.2 Fermi.
Well, proton radius we kind of.
But the gluonic one, not so well. I mean, we do maybe from coherent diffraction somewhat from the T-slopes. Right?
Yeah, it's claimed to be a bit less than the proton.
It's smaller. It's quite, It's
so certainly not 1.2.
No, it's less than the charge radius.
Yeah, smaller.
And those are all average radii, I guess. And I guess there are probably lots of fluctuations in event by event. Do you have fluctuations in your proton size?
Yeah, in principle. I mean, we haven't tried the case where we have a round proton and let the size fluctuate.
Yeah.
But what we do, of course, is we sample these 3 hotspots, right? Yes. And their position fluctuates according to a Gaussian. So they're sometimes further out or further in. And their size is also fixed at this point. So, but with that, we have some effective size fluctuation also in there. Yeah.
Yes. If they all happen to be towards the outside, then it would look like a bigger proton. And if all kind of towards the center.
Right, and this affects dramatically, fluctuations of your scattering amplitude in this, which is important for the incoherent vector meson projection, for example, in diffraction. And so this fluctuation and other fluctuations, like color chart fluctuations, so they affect strongly this incoherent cross-section, which we try to use to constrain how much fluctuations do we have. Okay, so now everyone is depressed.
But we have cookies.
We
have cookies, right?
Yeah.
Well, I thought I thought we were breaking up.
Okay.
Breaking up.
So if you have a question, feel free to ask.
I don't want to ask my questions in public. I don't want to.
You're on the record.
Well, I never heard Larry be shy about asking questions in front of other people. This directorship has done something.
Wait.
Let's stop the recording first.
We'll cut it out.
Oh, you can cut it.
I don't promise anything, but I can. Yes. Me. Let's see.
So I guess this is it for this, and then dinner at.
Yes. So for those of you who are coming along with us to dinner, we leave at 6:30 from the elevators. Reservations are at 7, so you can also meet us at the restaurant. It's called Mama Melina, and there was an email about it, right?
Yes.
So everyone.
What is the address again? Or where is it approximately?
It's University Village. It's kind of like the northwest corner of the University Village.
Northeast.
It's kind of
Right.
Just across the street from the university.
right. It's across the street.
Across
and it's-
25th.
So it's kind of outside of University Village, technically. Yeah, whatever it's
It's
called.
25th, this one.
It's on the Pacific. Oops, I don't know.
I think that street, by that time, I think it's turned into 25th.
I haven't been a local for many.
But, you know, you can find it on.
On map, yes.
Right. And tomorrow the plan is we have a talk by Barbara, and then after that, after coffee, what?
9:30.
Oh, at 9:30, yes. And then we'll have a coffee break, and then our conveners will lead the discussion.
By the way, if you want to walk there, it's a very nice walk. It's along the coast.
I'm not walking anywhere.
You aren't, but I mean, if any others want to walk.
Well, we
yeah,
got to walk.
Burke is right along the Burke Hill. You run into it.
Yeah. Or we can just cross the campus.
Yeah.
As we were gonna say.
It's also nice.
Yeah, I can do that.
It's also nice.
If you're confident in your navigating ability,
I
which I'm sure you are.
You've got the same device you just showed us.
No, I'll do it blindfolded. I'll put it in my pocket.
Don't worry about your confidence.
All right,
All right, let's do it.
Can I look at that sort of?
Can I listen to you?
I just want to understand. I missed the last half hour of the conversation.
Yeah.
So